The first step to making your electric fence shock harder and farther is grounding, okay? On the charger, you'll see the manufacturer put 1 ground rod minimum. That means if you want a minimal shock, you'll put in the very minimum, which is 1 ground rod. But if you want the shock farther and harder, you're going to put more ground rods in. And how do you do that? When it says 1 ground rod minimum, I'm going to put in 3 ground rods. 3 8-foot ground rods all the way in the ground. Now, it's rare that you'll be able to stick a ground rod vertically into the ground. Okay, it's probably not going to happen. So what I do is on a rebar bender, I'll bend my ground rods. And that way I can bury them horizontally like this. So the ground's up to about here and the ground rod's all in the ground. That way you can put it in easily and take it out easily. Now, if you don't have something to bend your rod, just put it in straight at a slight angle so the end of it's sticking out of the ground, and you have your ground rod clamp here, which makes a good solid connection to the insulated wire going from here to your charger. So what we do is take our 3 ground rods and we're going to space them out 10 feet apart. That means 1 ground rod's going to go here. Another one's going to go here. And another one's going to go here. And you connect all 3 of them with underground insulated wire that's made for 20,000 volts with for an electric fence. And that wire runs underground, comes up into the clamp, goes out to the next ground rod, underground out to the next ground rod, and underground out to the 3rd ground rod. So that's step number 1. Your fence has to be really grounded well. The connections have to be tight. We use ground rod clamps. We don't take the wires and wrap them around. That's a wimpy connection. Okay, if you want to make your fence shock harder and farther, don't use poly rope or poly wire. This is a piece of poly rope. You can see little tiny wires woven in those. Okay, electricity needs bigger wires to flow better. Smaller wires have more resistance and carry less electricity, which shocks less. So if you take a step, throw that stuff out, what it is really for is not for keeping pigs out or animals in. It's for well-trained animals for rotational grazing. Frequently, cows just see it and they know to stay away from it. It does not shock well. If you want something that shocks better than that, way better, you're going to choose 14 gauge wire like this. See how much thicker that is, how much more electricity it can handle, how much harder and farther it can shock. And if you want to go even better than that, you're going to use 12.5 gauge wire. Look at that, that's even bigger. It has less resistance. It carries the electricity farther and shocks harder. The next method to make your fence shock harder and farther is to use tight connections. You don't take 2 wires and just wrap them together and hope it connects. That's a very poor connection. Use a crimp sleeve to crimp these wires tight together, or use a split bolt where the wires go in the slot and you turn the nut and clamp them down hard together. That way the electricity can absolutely, positively go from one wire to the other and won't lose much, if anything. The last way to make your fence shock harder and farther is, notice we're in Hawaii. There's lots of weeds out there, but notice on this fence, none of those weeds are touching the fence, okay? So the last method is to keep your fence clear of anything touching it. No branches, no weeds, no nothing. Also notice that the ground is very moist here, okay? So the electricity, when the animal touches the fence, the electricity goes through the animal and into the ground and travels through the wet ground. Now, if the ground is dry and rocky, it can't travel back to the charger to complete the circuit, and the animal doesn't get much of a shock. So if your ground is dry and rocky, maybe you ought to consider something other than electric fence, which may not be your best choice in this situation. The bonus method to make your fence shock harder and farther is use jumper wires. Now here we have a 3-wire fence, okay? And what you'll notice on the top wire here, there's a jumper wire connecting the top wire to the middle wire of the fence. And then another wire going down to connect the bottom wire. So at this end of the fence here, all 3 wires are connected. And at the other end of the fence, again, all 3 wires are connected just like this. So how that makes your fence shock harder and farther is, this is 12.5 gauge wire. It has 56 ohms of resistance per mile. Okay, when we connect 2 wires together, now twice as much electricity can travel through those wires. And it only has half as much resistance. And then we add a 3rd wire. Now 3 times as much electricity can travel through 3 wires than 1 wire. So it shocks even harder. And it has, guess this, 1/3 the resistance. Because what this is known as, the wires are in parallel. And that decreases the resistance and makes your fence shock harder and farther.